There we go. We're live, Senator.
Thank you. We're going to pick up now with Eli from Oregon. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. Hello, everyone.
Hi,
Did I say
Eli.
it right? Oregon.
Oh my God,
Yes.
it's early.
Yeah, thanks for
Yes.
including me. Yeah, I've been had my screen on black because I'm just doing my morning things, but the sun's coming up here, and I love Vermont, so it's good to say hi.
Well, I hope you don't think we're too much in the beginning stages of this, but I welcome your education of us.
Sure. Well, yeah, I'd love to. I mean, Vermont was, I think, the first state in the country to require cities to allow ADUs. It's the same year that Washington State did it, and Washington State's law was toothless. But maybe what I'll do is I'll share my screen for a minute and share a few. I believe that pictures are worth 1,000 words also. But so to give you an idea of what's happening around the country in ADUs, and then home in right on your statute that's in front of you. So just let me see if I can share my screen. Does that work?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just gonna go pretty quickly through some slides that'll have some images of ADUs to give an idea of how eclectic they can be and some of the perspective. First, some famous ADU dwellers you probably know. I can't resist.
Sorry, Eli, could you just introduce yourself and what your expertise is and what you do?
That's a great idea. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. So I'm Eli Spivak. I'm from Portland, Oregon. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I developed affordable housing for about a decade, and since then I've been on my own building co-housing communities, including affordable housing. And I've worked with AARP for years to help educate about accessory dwelling units. But before that, I was in Portland 10 years ago, legalizing, changing the rules for them here and helping Portland spike from 20 a year to 600 or so a year. I co-wrote the accessory, the ABCs of ADUs, which is a pamphlet you might have. And I also launched a website called accessorydwellings.org. I'll have an image that which is now showcasing the stories from Vermont, your interviews. So I'm kind of a developer with a love of land use. I also I chair the Planning and Sustainability Commission in Portland. I have for the past couple of years. So that's my background.
Great.
Thanks.
And I built a few ADUs. So I'll go back to the screen share and thanks for reminding me to say hi in a real way.
Yeah, well, just give a context is useful.
Absolutely. Okay, so these are some famous ADU dwellers. You might know some of them. You put it together. Fonz living in the backyard in the garage. Thomas Jefferson lived in an ADU before building Monticello, and some others. And these are like today's ADU dwellers, people who have built a home. Usually the use of the ADU changes over time. So someone might build it for a mother-in-law or a father-in-law to help take care of a new grandkid, but then eventually years later, they might move into it themselves. Or in Portland, people are using ADUs as remote schools during COVID, or when people are isolating. So the uses flex over time in a really nice way. Here's the website, accessorydwellings.org, which we've got featured the stories from Vermont right now. We're always sharing different stories and policy changes from around the country from this website, including some model codes. Just to give a flavor for the kind of ADUs you see around the country. I mean, this is a housing type that we've been building long before zoning. So in Chicago, there are thousands of coach houses, that were first built for carriages, then cars, and then housing for people. In the southwest part of the country, you've got casitas. I grew up in Washington, D.C., where you got alley. It's an alley city, so you have the row houses facing the street, and then behind them, accessory dwellings for the help in the back. And then in New England, there's barns and things like that. A lot of times structures were built originally for carriages, then for cars, and then it became housing for people instead of housing for vehicles. And some of the examples of what they look like, sometimes people convert garages, they build side houses, they tuck them in the woods. In the bottom image of this, on the bottom center, that's an existing primary house. It was really small, and someone reclassified it as an accessory dwelling unit and built a new house on the same lot. So sometimes you can convert a small existing house to become an ADU. And in the bottom right, this is the case in Chicago area, where there's just a little coach house in the back, and it's tucked in the backyard. You can barely see it. Just to give an idea of what the crazy mix is, I mean, you got a Victorian that was lifted off the ground in the top middle, and an ADU tucked underneath it. You got these modern examples, tall, thin and narrow. On the bottom right, you've got the row house version where you've got it tucked underneath many houses on a street have a little daylit ADU. And cities have figured out that just legalizing ADUs doesn't quite get you there. You have to make it easy, help hold the hands of people, because the people who really build ADUs are, as Kelly said, they're amateurs. They don't really know what they're doing. Real estate agents don't necessarily know the rules for it. So we try and train them. So the real people building ADUs it's probably the only kind of housing in our country that's not built by developers predominantly. Developers build single family subdivisions all the time. They build 4+ unit apartments. They don't build ADUs. There's just not the efficiency of scale to do that. And especially since I'm talking to a group in Vermont, we have to be real about the local economic conditions. I mean, this is a map of Portland showing ADUs getting built. ADUs are allowed in the entire city on this map, but they focus in the parts of the city where the rents are fairly high because the economics work. If you can get the rent, you can build the building. Now, people will still build ADUs in less expensive areas for lifestyle reasons, to house a family member or someone with developmental disabilities, or just to have somewhere to downsize into. But the economics, when the economics are strong, that's when you see a lot of them get built. And I think that in Vermont, there's not that many areas where the economics are strong enough to cover the construction costs of an ADU. One of the things jurisdictions do is they help train people. They provide guidance online because homeowners don't know how to get building permits. They have to get a little hand-holding along the way. And I'm always pitching training real estate agents because those are the folks who really evangelize. Those are the ones who, at the point of sale, they advertise the unit as, and you could put an ADU on this property. It's important for them to know the rules. So a few national trends, and then I'll get down to your local rules. One of them is we're seeing cities across the country, this is more at the city level than the state level, experiment with loan products to help lower income homeowners create ADUs. So sometimes they provide a low interest loan with flexible terms, so long as the property owner rents out that ADU to a lower income renter for a couple of years, maybe the duration of the loan. So that's like, they're experimenting with this. None of these programs has gone to scale. I don't want to oversell them, but there's a lot of experimentation going on. This is in Silicon Valley in California. It's a mortgage product with a requirement for affordability while the loan's in play. And Habitat for Humanity affiliates, this is in Santa Cruz, California, are working with a homeowner, built an ADU for her daughter, moved into it, and eventually they might flip places over time. It's a flexible use over time. So Habitats naturally, who are trying to build single family homes to build wealth in communities, they can get 2 homes on a lot instead of 1. And then there's just the market rate version of this, because in most of the country, ADUs are not income restricted at all. But even with no restriction, something like 20% of them get rented for nothing. I mean, someone's making it available to a family member, a loved one, someone who can't make it in the rental market, and they're not charging rent. That person otherwise would be out competing with other housing. So this is an interesting stat that even with just the cost of writing the regulation, you get some de facto affordable housing from people just using the ADU as a safety net. Another trend we see more on the West Coast is using condominium law to separate the ownership between the ADU and the house. And that's a way of creating a first-time home buyer opportunity, because the ADU is going to sell for maybe a half the cost of any other house on that street. And it doesn't happen very commonly. I did it 10 years ago in Portland, but now you see dozens of people doing it in Portland. It's happened in Houston, Texas as well. So I don't think this is a model that's going to take off. It might not even be legal in some states, but it means you have maybe 2 owner-occupied homes on a lot instead of 1, but the same exact form as you could allow with a typical ADU. Here's a little plat of what it looks like on a plat map for the land use geeks out there. And then the state laws. And one thing we're seeing is some states in their state laws are requiring cities to create loan funds to help finance them. So Utah's doing that with their state law. California requires cities and counties to develop plans to incentivize and promote the creation of ADUs for lower income households. So no state is saying you have to have a low income requirement on your ADU, but they're saying we want to help get those programs going. And it's too early. And I should say Oregon provides funding because it takes work to change your land use codes. They provide a little bit of funding to help local jurisdictions actually do the work. This is all really new, so I can't really speak to how effective they are, but there's definitely an interest in trying to make this housing type available for lower income folks. So big picture, there's 9 states in the country, including Vermont, that require cities to allow ADUs. And if you go back 3 years ago, I think it was about 3. I mean, it's going pretty fast. And there's some cities that require people, the laws to have 2 ADUs, one internal and one detached. So Vancouver, British Columbia, that was the first. So that's in Canada, right? The first in the United States was Fayetteville, Arkansas, to require to allow 2 ADUs on a lot. Tigard and Portland, Oregon do that. Seattle, Washington, and every city in California. California state law requires that that on every lot you can do an internal and a detached ADU. So here's some trend stuff. In Portland, we went, as I said, from 24 a year to 1 per day, and now we're up above. It's gone down after this peak. Now that people sort of take for granted that they can do it. But we've seen quite a bit of ADU growth. And you wouldn't be surprised that the city with the biggest ADU growth is like a petri dish for them. It's Los Angeles, which originally resisted the state mandate to allow ADUs, but now they let them have them. And they've gone from like 15 ADUs to 6,700 ADUs 3 years after they adopted their program. And that's not because people built this many ADUs, it's because there were so many illegal ones already and people went legal with them, which is a great thing because they had to actually put in that smoke detector, the egress window, and deal with life safety things. But if you have low density development and high land costs, that's like the recipe for a lot of ADUs. So Oregon's law requires that states with cities over 1,000 residents have to allow ADUs. They're permitted outright. They're only subject to reasonable siting and design restrictions, and there's a lot of administrative rules to say what that means. And then we have subsequent laws that require the ADUs have to be you can't have an owner occupancy requirement in Oregon. You can't require additional parking for the ADU. And in homeowner associations, you can't block ADU construction. California allows every home to have a detached ADU and what they call a junior ADU, like a small ADU built within you have to be allowed both of them, and they cap the total square footage at 1,200 square feet between your ADUs. They have minimum sizes, 800 square feet, kind of similar to what you have. They prohibit owner occupancy. They limit parking minimums for ADUs. I think you can have 1 parking space. You can't require more than 1 parking space per ADU. And they waive impact fees for small ADUs. So cities can't charge for like water, sewer, parks, transportation fees if you're just building an ADU. And so Vermont, I've looked at your draft law and your current one. As I said earlier, I think you're the first state to do this. So congrats being ahead of the curve. You don't have as many what I call pre-legal ADUs as other cities. You don't have as much like a latent housing stock that's just going to get flipped to ADU. In the Northeast part of the country, there's more of a focus on owner occupancy and having a family relation in the ADU. That's part of Rhode Island's code. In the West, the focus has really been on legalizing smaller and less expensive housing options in areas that are expensive and where single family zoning has been used to exclude lower income residents. So the focus is really on democratizing and making it legal to have smaller homes. And there's been much less of a focus on owner occupancy. And also density and housing costs, as I said before, are less likely in Vermont to make ADUs take off in a big scale. It'll be more, I think, people doing it for their home real family situation. So here's your code. I'm going to gloss by this. This is the sort of the markup. But I had a few thoughts I'm going to leave you with, and then we can go to whatever discussion you'd like. First, in the bylaw, it says a jurisdiction. I'm going to read this so I get it right. A bylaw may require a single family dwelling with an accessory dwelling unit to be subject to the same dimensional review, blah, blah, blah. I think it's more, I was thinking that would say a bylaw shall. So this is a little bit of legal mumbo jumbo, but usually laws say that the same rules that apply for single family house, you can't be more restrictive when you allow an accessory dwelling unit. So if that's the intention, then you might do something like a bylaw may not require a single family dwelling with an ADU to be subject to review dimensions that's more restrictive than a single family dwelling. So that may just be legal mumbo jumbo, but I think that was.
Is that the intent? The intent should have said shall, because having it may is relatively toothless.
It doesn't do much, right? So you might look
You
at
do
that.
that already?
That may be the only answer, the simple answer. Yeah, I think that there are definitely examples from other states I could share where they have language which I think achieves what you're trying to do with a shall version.
Right.
Another thing you have in your law, which I think is great, is that you say that an ADU can be the greater of 900 square feet, or I think a third the size of the main house. And some places say the lesser of the two. And so I think it's great that you have the greater of the two, because if you say it's in the old version, which I think Vermont had, if you have a 600 or 900 square foot house, you can't do an ADU. There's like a small house penalty. You have to have a big house to have an ADU. And with your law, if you have a small 700 square foot house, you can still have an ADU. It's capped at 900 square feet, but you can have one. But with that, you might want to think about, you have some language saying that the ADU is clearly subordinate to the primary house. So maybe it'd be fair to say it shares a lot with the single family house, because there could have situations where you have a very small existing house and the ADU is bigger than it. It might be hard to be subordinate in that situation. I'll wrap through a couple more here and then just discuss. Owner occupancy requirements. I am not a fan of them. I understand the politics behind that. I can say that in some cities that used to have owner occupancy requirements, lenders have sent letters saying we can't finance this thing, the mortgage on the house. And the reason is because the way lenders think, they're going to foreclose it on it. They're going to end up owning it someday. That's the depressing way lenders think. And if a lender ever foreclosed on a house with an ADU and there's an owner occupancy requirement, they're immediately non-compliant with local zoning because the lender certainly doesn't live there. So we shouldn't think zoning based on lenders, but that has blocked financing options for people with ADUs when the local jurisdiction required owner occupancy. But the other thing is that it's just, there's no other housing type available, I'm pretty sure, that has tenure restrictions on it. I mean, there's no restrictions. You can't rent out a single family house, right? So it's a little bit of like, why do we make that special requirement for ADUs? On the West Coast, owner occupancy requirements are kind of unheard of. So I'm coming from a sense of a little bit of bias of experience. There's one thing that they floated around in Washington State, which you might consider, which, and this didn't quite make it into their final law, but I just present it as an example. They only allowed owner occupancy requirements where the ADU is used as a short-term rental, because there is a situation where they especially wanted to make sure there was an owner on site. Next couple of things here are shorter. One is prohibiting some bylaws, state laws in the country say you can't require a lot of parking for an ADU. So in some states like Oregon, you can't require any additional parking. In California, it's capped at how many spaces you can require, because parking takes up space, it costs money, it removes opportunities for trees on a site. Let's not make that additional cost of building an ADU. And the last one, I don't know if it's true in Vermont or not, whether you have impact fees for single family homes. If you do, there's a pretty good case to say they should be smaller or waived for an accessory dwelling unit. For a lot of the thing that really tipped the scales in Portland, where I live, to where ADUs took off is when Portland, it wasn't a zoning code thing at all. It was when Portland waived impact fees, which were like $15,000. Not a huge number in the cost of building a new ADU, but psychologically, it was a huge barrier for home buyers. So if you have something like that, you might not, that would make it easier to get them built. And I think that's I hate when having slides on the screen the whole time. So I'm gonna stop sharing and say thank you for entertaining this. I'll take questions if you want.
Eli, would you be kind enough to send, I know you sent us the ABCs of ADUs, but if you could send this particular presentation, that would be great, because your suggestions would be great to have.
Yeah, I'll send that to whoever's facilitating right after.
Scott Moore. Yeah. Great. May I just, Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
There are many, having lived in New York City, there are many places that actually, condominiums and stuff that do actually have rental requirements that you can't rent it for more than a year. So there are, those exist pretty. And
you're right. I should say that's in the associations routinely have that. That's a standard condominium.
So,
the zoning code is the part that doesn't usually.
Right. I understand, but I think just for me, one of the challenges is, and I mentioned it earlier, is the expectation that an ADU, which is different from just being a developer of properties, where is that there is an owner occupied expectation. And I know you don't think that's important, but actually I think that's important to a neighborhood, because it's important for people to be really invested in that community. And if it's just 3 sets of renters versus one person who actually owns and lives there and has emotional and civic ties to that community, I think it's slightly different. And I think my concern actually going forward is if they sell this, let's say a lot with 3 units, if they sell it, how do we guarantee it continues to actually be owner occupied, or that there is one, the owner lives in one of those units? I don't care where they live, but that the owner is still living there and still a member of that community. Because I think that's the problem we have with our short-term rentals. I mean, I think it's an issue in Vermont and maybe in many communities around the country.
Mr. Chair, go ahead.
But usually when cities do have owner occupancy, they have a recorded document that has to record against the properties for future situations. Portland used to have owner occupancy requirement until 1996. They dropped it at that point because it wasn't getting enforced and it wasn't being a problem. But that's, that's a lot of years back and experience. But even today, that's usually the way people address the concern you've just raised.
So my question as a follow-up to that is, it's a very basic question. I don't know if other people are struggling with it, but if you don't have an owner occupancy requirement, at least starting out, how does it get distinguished from a duplex?
Right.
As I heard that question early on when I had my screen blank, it is from a financing angle, it's just like a duplex. And that actually, there's an article in Appraisal Journal showing how you can value an ADU. If there's no owner occupancy requirement, you can get a better as-built evaluation of it. If you just evaluate it as a duplex, it's just like a duplex where one of the units is smaller than the other one, basically. So that's kind of the answer to your question. There are some cities, including the state of Oregon, where now on every single family lot, you are allowed to do a duplex by right, and a triplex and a fourplex too. I mean, it's very flexible. The ADU, this is in Oregon, state of Oregon.
Because we have some language to that effect, or try to do some language to that effect.
Yeah, I mean, the name ADU is less relevant as there's more options available. That's correct.
So, yes, Senator Rahm.
So first of all, I don't know if it's come up fully in context on this committee, but as someone who was elected to the legislature as a renter, which is still unfortunately all too rare when I first started, I really resent the idea that long-term renters aren't civically engaged or don't care about their community. So I do just want to put that out there, and actually really appreciate it, knowing that there's a state that distinguishes between short-term rentals, which can get out of hand, and long-term renters who are very much a part of their communities. So I really value looking at that. I think in general, and even bringing up duplexes, even now in many communities, there is a lot size requirement, even for turning something into a duplex. And, what I think I want to say out loud that felt like it was underlying your presentation is that a lot of these provisions were based on classism, and more in other states than Vermont, but racism. And, really deciding when it's appropriate for certain people with a certain house size to be able to do what they want versus restricting that for others. And so I just wondered if you could comment on that in ways that you've seen us really get at the deep foundation of classism that's built into a lot of our zoning, so we can dismantle it and not just put something else on top of it.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. That's great points. And really, I think a lot of the advocacy especially on the West Coast, where I've seen it the most, comes from the history of zoning as a way to exclude folks from neighborhoods. So I've looked at, Portland has a reputation for being progressive. Portland's zoning in the 1950s ended up covering most of the city with single family zoning. And it was done explicitly to replace deed restrictions on houses that prohibited people of color from living in that neighborhood, because those were no longer enforceable. So people figured out that if you decrease the zoning allowance, then all you can afford to build are large houses, and that by proxy would exclude people of color. So there's a strong reaction to that that's been happening over the past decade, where communities have said, look, that's messed up. We've got to make sure that communities don't use zoning to keep less wealthy people out. And ADUs are in some ways a camel's nose under the tent on that. I mean, it's the most politically palatable way to open up neighborhoods to less expensive housing that also works for seniors, that also works for expand large, intergenerational households. But I think that there's a recognition that our zoning history is not something to be proud of in this standpoint. And I don't know the history in Vermont at all. I don't want to claim to, but that is tied up with the owner occupancy thing somewhat, because nowhere in our zoning codes do we restrict housing based on someone's tenure, in almost anywhere I've seen. So I understand the impetus behind it, but I think that there's reason why some states have said, look, cities, that's not an option. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
So thank you, Senator Hansdale. So I just want to, obviously, when we passed this law in 1992, we were at the forefront of making changes to open up single family zones, and we had to go with certain compromises, and yes, there's still some compromises in our law now. Just getting back to whether ADUs just apply to single family zones. If you had a zone right now that allowed for duplexes, could the ADU law allow for 4 units to go into that zone?
Usually at the state level, I haven't seen this, but at the city level, where duplexes are allowed, usually they'll say you can do a duplex or a house with an ADU. You couldn't like quadruple your count. Does that make sense? You could also say that if a city allows.
I don't know if it makes sense in terms of the housing crunch we have now. I mean, if there are restrictions on ADUs, why some of those zones that allow duplex couldn't allow small accessory units on each half of the duplex? I don't know.
Sure, if it fits in the footprint, yeah.
This has been great, by the way. I hope we can call on you again as we work through this. I think there's a lot of opportunity here, both on the legal side of zoning and making what is permissible, but obviously the big nut to crack is the implementation size, even getting people more aware and being able to utilize the existing law we have. So sounds like you have expertise in both. So
yeah, this was terrific, Eli. Thank you very much.
I'll share the slides, and you can get to me via Kelly and AARP for follow-up. And AARP, I should say, has published a really fantastic model code, not just for city ADU, but state ordinances as well. And you can get that too. It's got more discussion on parking and ownership and all that stuff.
Right.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great.
It was great.
And I noticed that Kelly has posted the ABCs of ADUs on the chat.
Yeah, it's on, and I am hoping that we'll get Eli's presentation because it's got the recommendations in it, which the ABCs don't.
So I see that Tom Cavett is with us, but I want to hear briefly if before we change subjects from Tyler. Tyler, can you give us your insights on this in about 5 minutes?
Do it in 4.5.
Great. Tyler, don't rush it.
So my name is Tyler Moss. I'm a program manager with Vermont State Housing Authority. Thank you again for having me here. It's been 2 years since I was in that little room with y'all. And basically here to talk quickly about the Montpelier ADU program, which was started as a pilot. And it was very different because it was started with community development block grant funds. We used also money from the city of Montpelier, where the pilot program is, as well as some matching funds from Vermont State Housing Authority. So program was cranking when it first started in about late summer, early fall of 2019, and we hit a roadblock in March of 2020, which really slowed down the ADU productions. Right, having people in your home, contractors otherwise, was not what was on people's mind, and so the Vermont State Housing Authority shifted to, really we needed to concentrate on our emergency rental assistance program, which I've been running for the past 2 years or year and a half now. So that's getting $1 million out the door every week has taken up most of my time, but we have still managed to keep the pilot program going, and we have completed 4 projects in Montpelier. We have 2 that are under construction right now. We have another one that is permitted and has a contractor and is ready to start in April. We have another one in the design phase. So we're pretty confident that we will meet our goal of creating 7 units before September of 2022. So that's been great. It's we used about $200,000 to create those units, so $50,000 per unit. The average cost was about $75,000 per unit, and so the homeowners had some buy-in ranging from $50,000 to $25,000 of their own money, mostly through home equity or construction loans. So one of the interesting things that I've found, right? So I lived in an ADU in the 90s for 3 years, and I didn't even know what an ADU was, right? I found out 10 years later that I was living in an ADU because my sister had a kid and asked if I would come help. So I needed a cheap place to live. She needed some support. And so then 10 years later, 2010, 11, I started working with the Brattleboro Area Affordable Housing to create their volunteer program to create ADUs. And since they started, they've created about 50, and I was involved in about half of those over the course of that time. I think that one thing that should be noted is that there's a lot of fear of these federal dollars and how hard they are to work with. One thing that we have here in Vermont is a really amazing Department of Housing and Community Development. They have been so great to work with, and I'm not just buttering up to get more money, which I do want, but it's true. They've walked us through every step of of what we needed to do with those federal dollars, and really the federal dollars have required things that we would not have found otherwise. Right? We had a home that found asbestos in it. Right? 2 young kids under the age of 5 in the home. What would happen if they were just, most contractors wouldn't be testing for it, but we required it with the environmental review. We had another home with radon in it. They're not necessarily testing for radon after construction in a normal, ADU project. Another home with children. We require contractors to have their lead paint, their lead safe construction, right? So you would be surprised how many big name construction companies are big for Vermont do not have these lead safe certificates to do this work, to do the renovation and painting work that they need to do. And so this forces them to work within those environmental guidelines. So that is a huge advantage of the federal money, because people don't necessarily do that. It costs money, it costs time, and it's a step to skip. I really feel strongly that the federal dollars, for that reason alone, for the safety of the occupants and the families that are there, that it's a great option for people. I know that we're going to meet our mark, like I said, and I won't repeat all of this stuff, right? The capacity and the money and all the challenges that everybody's talked about. But some of the things that we do see is it's different from the West Coast, right? Most of our ADUs it's the middle income people that are building it because they need the income, right? And that's why they're building it. We don't see them in the wealthier neighborhoods with these huge houses. We don't see these $200,000 detached units as much in Vermont because it's just not us, right? We see people turning their basement, turning their garage, making a small addition. That's Vermont. It's a small grassroots community, and that's the way we work. And I think that that's something that we can really focus on is the internal conversions. They're not going to have the pretty pictures that you see in Dwell magazine or, in these other things. But, I ride around my neighborhood in South Burlington and I see a million raised ranches. And those are perfect for ADUs. I mean, Vermont, unfortunately, we have one of the highest divorce rates, right? So we have these houses that are sitting empty all the time, or they're split up. They don't need the housing all the time. Raised ranches already have bathrooms in the basement almost always. They have egress built in. There's usually a 2-car garage. There's plenty of parking, and they're not in dense areas, right? So they're in the areas around like Burlington. You see in Colchester and Essex and South Burlington, they're all over the place. And so we need, I think, the internal conversion, pushing on that. It's the least obstructive. My pictures mostly would show houses that look exactly the same. They wouldn't have these beautiful separate things. They'd be just, oh, there's an ADU there. I didn't even know it. So that's something that I think that needs to be really remembered when we're talking about ADUs is who we're marketing towards. We're marketing for Vermont. We're marketing towards middle class. And so that's we can do that. And we can also help the people because this is a major project in their home, right? And it's not their top priority. Their top priority is getting to work and getting their kids to school and stuff. And so having that technical support is really a big component. And it was 2 years ago around right now that I said we need $1 million and the state could really get a program up and running. And so
Tyler, let me ask you a question. Thank you very much for that and for your service, both at the State Housing Authority and on this program. When we talk about the VHIP program, we're giving out grant money to landlords to help rehab a house. And I mean, now it's $30,000. I guess, and there's talk of raising it to $60,000. How is that? In what way is it different than giving money out for an ADU? I mean, they both get you a new rentable unit out there, and one may be more appropriate or easier to do than the other. So shouldn't they, I mean, we're talking about the VHIP program now running in the neighborhood of $32 million being appropriated, and we have $150,000 for technical assistance for ADUs. Could you just comment on that?
Yes. So I've been working with Sean Gilpin for 10 years on discussing ADUs, and I think the VHIP program and the ADU program can definitely combine. That it allows for ADUs. VHIP is mostly marketed towards landlords. I think that's what the part of the issue is. I think there needs to be an increase in marketing towards homeowners to let them know, if it can do that. Otherwise, right now, most of the people that see that are they're landlords, and so they're looking to renovate apartments.
So they're both valuable programs.
Absolutely.
At this point, the VHIP program is getting all the resources, and the ADUs are getting very little. Okay, I really appreciate your time.
Great, Tyler. Thanks.
And we're going to move now. We're not going to take another break because we have to be on the floor at 11:30. We're going to move to Tom Cavett. I want to say, first of all, welcome, Tom. I really like your portrait. It's more an action one than most people have.
It's also kind of old.
I wasn't going to say anything. I wasn't going to say anything, but you're right.
So, Tom, we asked you, we've been talking a bunch about capital investment program, which I know you're familiar with. We talked about it last year. We shaved it down considerably because we wanted to see how it would work before we put in, the governor had proposed $30 million in 3 years, each to a total of $90 million. I think we gave about 11, but we also wanted a second set of eyes on, the process. And so I don't think we named you in statute, but we might as well have. Well, maybe we did. We said the legislative economist. We're now hearing some criticism of that move on our part because it's slowing down the grants, and it's also, I think the bigger concern is it's limiting the size of the grants, maybe not your involvement, but a requirement on ranking return on investment. I don't know if you've heard all of those criticisms, but just want to hear generally what your thought on how the program's working. And, we're being asked to make some changes to it. You may not be familiar with those are, but just your overall thoughts on the program and your involvement to date.
Yeah. So it's very much a work in progress. So it's a little bit early to be drawing conclusions about it when the review process, and not just the technical review process looking at the economics of these, but also the process that Joan and the people making decisions are going through. It's too early to say where all of that will shake out. I think the process in general is slow because there's a more careful review of some of the criteria that are involved, and that requires a lot more back and forth with the applicants. The early applications were really deficient in information content and quality, and required, back and forth to narrow that down. There also have been more applicants than anybody thought there would be. So that's also created, so yeah, it'd be great to be cutting ribbons now, but I think the thoughtfulness that's going into it probably will improve the efficacy of the program. I haven't seen in writing any of the proposals for change or criticisms or things like that, so I'd be happy to respond to those if and when that's available. I do think we need to sort of see it to the point where awards are actually being made to really assess the extent to which the process as it was tried out this time is the best one. There's certainly some obvious things about the measurement of and valuation of positive externalities to the analysis of net fiscal impact that I think need to be done outside of the model, and they could be done with sort of a fixed value approach or some other metric that we could use that would either affect the award or be an add-on or something that would give that more priority. But I think that putting things through an economic lens will make it more efficacious and more impactful. But I know that's also frustrating to those who would like it to be more subjective and freewheeling, and just to be able to make decisions about where the money goes without too many other fetters to the process.
Well, let me just throw out a couple of the thoughts that I've heard, and maybe you can respond to them. The proposal, I think the concern that they would have is, I think, just to be blunt, I don't know if it's a criticism, but I think they would not want this to be subject to the economist's review and input. Two, they would like the grants to be limited to a smaller amount, to $1 million. Last year, they were concerned that we were limiting it too much to $1.5 million. I don't know whether they want to, I think they may want to get rid of the return on investment requirement, but at the very least, they don't want the ranking system to be there, that they have to make the decision, prioritize based upon ROI of a project. And so in some ways, I think they want to move, and Senator Clarkson knows a lot about this as well. I think they want to move less from the transformational nomenclature they gave this money back then to more smaller projects like building a daycare center or, fixing up a library or stuff like that, as opposed to that. Senator Clarkson, do you want to add a little bit to that?
Yeah, I'd love to add. Tom, it's good to see you. I think that sadly, the Treasury's rules are really what has reined it in the big vision, the Daniel Burnham scale vision of how, because I think we were all hoping to have sort of regional transformational opportunities that would be much bigger projects than what we're looking at here. On the other, so I think that's not us. I think that's Treasury, and I think to be ARPA eligible, that's our challenge. However, I think people don't. I think having an economic lens to look through it isn't a bad thing. I think it just needs to be a little more flexible and a little more understanding of something like net fiscal impact. So let's take the Randolph Child Center, which is an incredible program, a project that's been proposed. The net fiscal impact can't just be the income of the people who are working at the child center. It's got to, and I think there are only like 30 or 32 of them that are expected. It's got to be the net fiscal impact on all those 86 families of the kids who were able to go back to work. So the net fiscal impact to our economy might actually be huge because it enables people to be back at work. So that's where I think the net fiscal impact has to be flexible in understanding its economic impact more fully. So I would say, and we have a bunch of examples of that. We have housing Afghan refugees in Brattleboro. Well, the staff income there is very modest, but the impact on the community and the impact on the families that are going to be there so I think, Tom, we need to put your creative mind into that economic lens so that we can figure out how to evaluate and these programs in a little more creative and flexible way.
Yeah, so I would agree, Senator Sorokin, that added flexibility would be good, and would expect after we've actually gone through the entire process, which we haven't done for any single project, and not because it's been delayed by the economics of it, but there are lots of things that have to do with the ARPA side of it that we don't even get into, that right. They'll put a project out, they'll say, yeah, do this one. Then they'll say, oh, no, don't do that one, do another one. And then the parameters will change. Somebody will put in the wrong numbers or numbers that don't make sense. And then you have to go back and forth. So when the process has been completed, I think we'll have a better perspective on that. The measurement of positive externalities is not simple. So there are about 6 areas of positive externalities that we've looked at ways to measure and include in net fiscal impact. And all of them have some difficulties. They're education, climate, labor force participation, downtown development, racial justice, and tourism. So all of those have aspects that can be beneficial in a particular project to varying degrees and impactful. None of them are as simple as they may seem at the surface level. So when you look at education, like if you have a museum, you say, well, certain number of students go to that museum as part of a classroom experience. And they benefit from what the museum has. And you could take the hours of the day and the time that they go there and value that at what we spend publicly at the state level on those students. But in actuality, there's no savings to the state from them going there because the school's still open, the teacher's still paid, the building's still heated. And, so you can't really say credibly there's a net fiscal gain. With climate, we have ways to measure cost of carbon and impacts that we use in some regulatory proceedings, but those don't flow through to the state budget in a short-term direct way that credibly you can put that in and say, yeah, that's going to be net fiscal impact. Labor force participation is also not as simple as it looks. The academic literature on this, Allison, is that where you can provide low-income assistance or free, reduced cost childcare, you get measurable impacts in labor force participation. Market rate childcare is different, and almost all of the applicants so far have been advancing projects with market rate childcare. And the link to labor force participation change with that is much more tenuous. You also have a measurement problem when you take the labor of a parent at home, which is not counted as GDP. It's not a part. So if a mother or a father stays home and cares for a child, that's meaningless activity in terms of GDP accounts and economic models. If you then pay somebody else to do that child care, you create a job. And if the parent then takes a job, you create two jobs. And that's the way the model would run.
Right. I think, Tom, that's where the model's flawed. Because a person not working and doing full-time parenting and homemaking is actually does have a financial impact on a family. So there is financial impact there, and it's significant.
Right, but it's not counted in any of the national.
I don't care if it's not counted.
I know. I totally get
problem.
it. But actually, that would reduce the impact of childcare if you're measuring additional childcare, because you're swapping one labor for another. Even if you don't do that, you are not at market rates. You're not bringing a lot more people into the labor force by creating market rate childcare. That's what the economy is doing now. So where you draw people in is through assistance to people who can't afford it. So it's an income problem as much as a supply problem. And this is true in a lot of areas where we say, there's a shortage of something. Well, there's a shortage at a particular price. And that has an income component and a supply component.
Right. But I don't know a childcare center that doesn't take families that also have assistance in childcare support.
Right.
So, they don't exist. As far as I know, they don't exist. So I don't know how that's possible to even conceive of, because the income ranges with childcare are all over the place. They're wide ranging.
Right. But we could look at that effect, but that then also has a state cost in that the state is paying for that and also bringing someone in, which diminishes the net fiscal impact at the state level, even if it's doing a public good that we all think is important and all the rest. So that's why I'm saying it would be useful to have something outside of the model that is a simpler kind of add-on than just doing it through a net fiscal impact lens. We can't credibly just throw out a number and say, oh, we think 10% of those daycare slots are going to result in new jobs. There has to be credible analytic evidence to support it. And the most recent studies on this don't point to it unless there's it's low rate. So if you look at nations, for example, that offer free daycare, they have higher labor force participation rates. All right. So that is getting rid of the income problem altogether, and you have higher labor force participation rates. That's not what we're trying to model when you say we're just going to have more market rate development of childcare positions. And arguably, there's as much of a problem in this area in terms of attracting workers, which is a whole nother area, as there is just the construction and building of for-profit childcare centers. When you get to downtown development, you have a similar kind of thing. We know that's a public good. We spend a lot of money trying to direct projects to downtown, but then, you know, what is the value of that for some other development? What if it happens in a downtown area that's not necessarily designated downtown, but we all know of it and think of it as a downtown? It's better if some of that would be subjective and have some sort of fixed marker. Racial justice too is a very hard thing to pin down a dollar amount on. It's not, you know, there are many studies that show enormous costs to long-term costs to an economy from that kind of discrimination and the lack of opportunity and what that does to an economy. But it's not an easy thing to quantify and put in the model. Tourism is the only area so far that we have, you know, pretty good data on what those impacts might be. And we can look at spending patterns if somebody stays an extra day, if somebody comes only because of something. But the really critical thing that the models look at always, first step, is what would happen in the absence of this expenditure? Are we really buying something that wouldn't happen without the expenditure? And that is something I think that ACCD would love to shed and just say, we just want to give it out where we think it's going to do something good, regardless of whether that would happen in the absence of the grant or not. And that is something I think I would push back on, because you are always wasting money if you spend money to do something that would happen in the absence of it. It's not always easy to tell, but there are we've gotten financial data from, you know, people that are big developers of housing, and they're building market rate housing. All right, there's great demand for housing. Housing prices are way up. It's a great time to develop. But that doesn't mean that they need state money or public money to make that happen. And that is a lens that I think is really important to have present. So you can design it without the economics, but you'd want to have in place some things that were safe guardrails to maximize the impact of it, because you want it to be as impactful as possible.
So I don't understand, what I don't understand, Tom, is you're almost suggesting another but-for test.
Yes, that's what I hear.
But
you have to have a but-for test. I mean, that's fundamental to any economic analysis. If you don't pass that, then there is no net fiscal impact, because the project would have occurred anyway.
But
you can't have any positive fiscal impact. Pardon?
Okay, what I don't understand, however, is the existing law we passed, it just calls to show that there's a return on investment to the public. It doesn't necessarily have a threshold of how much a return on investment there is. So there could be $1 returned on the investment, right? That doesn't mean that a private entity or another entity, nonprofit or whatever, would go ahead with that project. Is there? I'm having a little disconnect whether you're saying that these kinds of transformational grants, which are no longer transformational, but these kind of grants should not happen if they would otherwise
anyway
happen. Or
yeah, if they would happen anyway, why would you want to put public money? Why would you want to spend public money to do something that would happen if you didn't spend the public money?
But how do you actually know it would happen if we didn't? I mean, to me, it's like a classic catch-22. I mean, with the but-for test. I mean, you can't actually say that it wouldn't have happened without that incentive. I mean, you can't always.
It is difficult. It is very difficult to say and to get a read on that. And it is impossible to know for sure in each case. But there are things that are indications on the way things are financed, the types of projects availability of capital, all sorts of things that can give you information about that. That's sort of what VEPSI tries to do with every single project that comes before them. It's not easy, but
Okay,
that's
Tom,
part of making public
we're-
expenditures impact.
Randy's
We're gonna
got
have to-
some.
Well, we have to go to the floor.
Okay.
I'm gonna have to cut this off, but, we may have you back, but one of the messages I'm getting for you is that there hasn't been a single grant issued yet. And before we change the project, we should review some of the successful applications and what went into them. Let's not change things before we even know the first round of results. So, okay.
And Randy had been wanting to ask a question.
If you want, Senator Brock, go ahead, but we are 1 minute from floor time. I apologize.
We'll say in 1 minute, what we have heard is that not everything is measurable. And
Yes,
that we have to understand. And there are some things that we will make a decision on based on judgment. We've been doing it for years and we have to continue to do it. Period.
That's right. That's right. And that can be done a lot of different ways, and we'll make some recommendations, and so will ACCD, and then you can do what you want with it. But I think that's true.
yeah,
A classic example is in TIF. As I look at downtown St. Albans, you could argue that TIF may or may not have caused something to happen. But I can say that, well, it was either Martians or lightning or a virus that caused the transformation of downtown. I don't care, but we did TIF, it happened, and I'm satisfied with it.
right.
Right. And I think that's a good example,
And-
because the only thing I would say is it's not that there's no cost to it. The cost of that was paid for by other political jurisdictions in the state. So it's not necessarily free. And that's the thing I think is important. You bought something with that, and that's good.
All right.
Yeah, nothing is free. And I think sadly, we are expected on the floor right now.
Yes.
Okay.